There's a kind of cold that settles into places long before winter arrives. Not weather, something older. The kind that lives in the space between a man's last footprint and the empty ice beyond it, where nothing disturbed the snow and no explanation ever came. Welcome to Dead Quiet. Real cases, real investigations, real people who walked into ordinary mornings and left something behind that no one has been able to recover. Not the investigators, not the families, not the years that followed. Tonight we're in Canada, the deep kind, 4 documented cases that are still officially open. A geological technician whose footprints crossed a frozen Manitoba lake and stopped mid-stride in the open center of the ice, as if the world simply ended there. A rural nurse who called 911 on a phone line, investigators confirmed, had been cut 15 minutes before she made the call. A contractor who broke through a false wall behind a church altar and found children's shoes arranged in perfect circles on a concrete floor, with names written inside that matched cold cases no one had touched in 30 years. And a marine researcher whose final radio transmission exists on tape, her voice quiet, certain, saying it twice before the line went dead. They are not whales. The fear in these cases doesn't announce itself. It lives in the evidence, in what was found and what was never found, in the particular silence of a file that stays open because nothing was ever enough to close it. If that's what brings you here, subscribe to Dead Quiet and turn on notifications. These cases surface when they're ready, because the Canadian wilderness doesn't ask permission. It doesn't leave explanations. It simply takes and waits and keeps its secrets the way deep ice keeps everything, perfectly and without effort. So settle in, let the noise fall away, and remember, in the wild, silence is never empty. There is a particular kind of silence that exists only in the Canadian North in February. It is not the comfortable silence of a quiet room or a still morning. It is the silence of total absence. No birds, no traffic, no wind through leaves because there are no leaves. Only bare black spruce, standing like sentinels in a white that stretches in every direction until the horizon disappears. People who have worked in that country long enough either learn to love that silence or they leave. Derek had learned to love it. Derek was 38 years old, a geological field technician with 11 years of experience in remote northern postings. He worked for a mineral exploration company that operated a fly-in base camp roughly 320 kilometers northeast of Thompson, Manitoba, a location accessible only by a small chartered aircraft that arrived twice a week to drop supplies and rotate personnel. There was no road access, no cell service. Temperatures in February regularly plunged past -45 degrees Celsius with wind chill. The nearest hospital was the length of a 2-hour flight away on a good day. Derek had chosen this life deliberately. He was methodical and calm, the kind of man who checked his equipment twice before every job, filed his paperwork without reminders, and never gave his supervisors any reason to worry. The camp manager, a veteran of 15 northern postings himself, described Derek as the most reliable man on the team. That assessment made what happened on February 4th, 2020, even harder to process. There was one detail from the days before Derek disappeared that investigators would later spend considerable time examining. 3 nights before he vanished, 2 other workers at the camp independently reported hearing a low, rhythmic sound coming from the direction of the frozen lake. Both described it the same way, a slow, repeating knock, like something striking the underside of the ice from below. They each reported it to the shift supervisor, who logged it in the camp maintenance record as probable ice contraction due to temperature fluctuation. It was a reasonable explanation. In extreme cold, ice contracts and shifts, producing deep groaning and knocking sounds, but the workers who heard it said it was too regular, too deliberate. A supervisor who later reviewed that maintenance log told investigators it was the detail that troubled him most about the whole case. Not the disappearance itself, that rhythmic knocking that two separate people heard on 3 consecutive nights, coming from a lake that was frozen solid to a depth of nearly 2 meters. Nobody could explain what would produce that sound from below the ice at that depth. On the morning of February 4th, Derek woke at his usual time of 5:45. His bunkmate, a driller named Gary, heard him moving around, the familiar sounds of instant coffee being made, bootlaces being tightened. Derek told Gary he was heading to the East Ridge survey marker to finish elevation readings before a weather front moved in. It was exactly the kind of job Derek would do, exactly the kind of morning he would choose to do it. He signed out on the camp whiteboard at 6:10, as required by protocol, and noted his route, 2.4 kilometers across the frozen lake to the East Ridge. The same route everyone used, the same lake the crew had been crossing since November. Ice thickness had been professionally tested 4 days earlier at 1.6 meters, more than sufficient to support a loaded vehicle, let alone a single person walking. By 11:30, Derek had not called in on the radio. Mandatory check-ins were every 2 hours without exception, a protocol that existed specifically because of the conditions. His supervisor attempted contact 6 times. No response. A 3-man search team assembled at 12:15 and set out across the lake following the signed route. They found his tracks within 10 minutes of leaving camp. Derek's footprints were clear in the thin crust of wind-blown snow that covered the ice surface. His stride was steady and even, the prints of a man walking with purpose and confidence across terrain he knew well. The spacing was consistent. The depth was consistent. There was nothing in those footprints to suggest anything other than a man going about his morning. And then, 1.1 kilometers across the lake, approximately halfway to the East Ridge, the footprint stopped. Not at a crack, not at the shore, not near any feature, any disturbance, any visible irregularity in the ice surface. The prints simply ended, mid-stride, in the open center of the lake. The final footprint showed full weight transfer, the heel down, the toe pressing forward as if Derek was already lifting his other foot for the next step. But there was no next step. Beyond that final print, in every direction, the snow surface was completely undisturbed, pristine, as if nothing had ever crossed it. The search team stood there in the cold and stared at the last impression of Derek's boot. One of them later described the feeling in a way that ended up in the official investigation notes. He said it felt like the world had ended at that point, like the ice simply ran out and there was nothing beyond it, even though you could see the far shore fine. He said it was the most frightening thing he had ever seen, and he had worked northern postings for 9 years. The team drilled test holes at the termination point, ice depth 1.7 meters, no fracture lines radiating outward, no water seepage, no disturbance in the snow crust around the final print that would indicate weight shifting, stumbling, or any physical interaction with the surface. Forensic analysts, who later examined photographs and measurements of the prints, confirmed something chilling. The depth and spacing indicated a walking pace of approximately 5 kilometers per hour throughout. Derek was not slowing down. He was not hesitating. Up until the moment his footprints ceased to exist, he was walking exactly as he always walked. The search that followed was extensive. Helicopters equipped with thermal imaging cameras swept 80 square kilometers of terrain over the first 48 hours. Ground teams with search dogs covered every meter of both shorelines and the surrounding forest. Divers were brought in, though everyone involved agreed it seemed physically impossible that Derek could have gone through ice that thick without leaving any trace. They found nothing. Not a piece of clothing, not a single additional footprint, not a shred of equipment. What they did find, when they finally reached the East Ridge survey marker, was everything Derek had left there the day before. His equipment was set up exactly as he had left it. The data card was still recording. His field notes were in the equipment case. He had planned to return that morning to finish 2 specific readings. He had organized his materials in anticipation of that return. He never arrived. 18 days after Derek's disappearance, a bush pilot named Roy Caldwell made an unscheduled fuel stop at a small frozen lake approximately 55 kilometers west of the base camp. While conducting a check of his aircraft's ski landing gear, Roy noticed a figure standing at the tree line on the opposite shore, roughly 80 meters away, completely motionless. Roy called out. No response. He waved. Nothing. He began walking toward the figure across the ice, calling out as he went. At 30 meters he could see clearly. A man, average height and build, wearing a high-visibility orange and yellow work jacket, the exact type issued to survey crews operating in the region under the Mineral Exploration Company's safety protocols. Roy shouted. The figure did not react, and then, without turning around, without any preparatory movement, the figure simply walked backward into the forest, not spinning around to run, not stumbling, walking in reverse, moving between the trees with a fluid, unhurried ease that Roy described as deeply wrong. He said the figure never once glanced behind itself. It moved as if it knew precisely where every tree was without needing to look, as if the forest behind it was not an obstacle but a destination it was being drawn toward. Roy ran. He crossed the ice and crashed into the tree line. He found nothing. No tracks, no broken branches, no compression in the snow beneath the trees. He searched for 40 minutes, moving in expanding circles. The forest was undisturbed. Whatever he had seen, it had left no mark on the world it had moved through. Roy was interviewed by RCMP investigators 3 separate times over the following 2 weeks. His account never changed. Not a single detail varied. Investigators noted in their reports that Roy had no prior relationship with Derek and had required a photograph to be shown to him before he could confirm the clothing style matched what Derek had been wearing. He identified the jacket type immediately and without hesitation. A ground search of the area where Roy reported the sighting found nothing. The RCMP documentation of his account is preserved in the active missing persons file as a credible witness report of an unverified sighting. The base camp quietly rerouted its lake crossing in the weeks that followed. Workers were no longer asked to walk the route Derek had taken. A tracked vehicle path was cut through the bush to access the East Ridge. Nobody held a meeting about it. Nobody announced the change. It simply happened, because nobody was willing to walk across that ice anymore. The rhythmic knocking beneath the lake, the sound that had been reported on 3 consecutive nights before Derek vanished, was heard again twice in the weeks after his disappearance. 3 separate workers logged it independently on different nights. The company's geologist suggested gas pockets under pressure. The workers who heard it did not find that convincing. Derek's family, based in Winnipeg, hired a private investigator who spent 2 weeks in the region. He interviewed every member of the camp crew, reviewed all documentation, and walked the route across the lake himself. He submitted a report to the family that acknowledged he had no explanation for what had happened. He returned the family's retainer. He said he could not charge them for work that had produced nothing. The RCMP missing persons file for Derek remains open. No body has ever been recovered. No evidence has ever been found beyond those footprints and Roy Caldwell's sighting. And to this day, the only tangible record of Derek's final morning is a set of boot prints in the snow on a frozen Manitoba lake. Prints that walk steadily across the ice and then, without reason or explanation, simply cease to exist. Sandra was not the kind of woman who panicked. In 10 years as a rural nurse practitioner, she had dealt with farm accidents, cardiac events, difficult childbirths in situations where the nearest hospital was 45 minutes away. She had a reputation in her small community for staying calm when everyone else around her was falling apart. Her colleagues called it a gift. Sandra called it training. She had learned, through years of managing medical emergencies alone, to keep her voice level and her thinking clear, regardless of what her body was doing. That training is what makes the recording of her 911 call so deeply disturbing, because even in that call, even as the situation deteriorated into something her training had never prepared her for, she kept her voice level for as long as she possibly could. Sandra was 35 years old and lived alone in a 2-story farmhouse built in the 1930s, located 22 kilometers outside the town of Valley View, Alberta. She had moved to the region 8 years earlier, drawn by a posting at the local clinic that allowed her to serve a scattered rural population that had limited access to medical care. The farmhouse was practical and isolated. The nearest neighbor, a family named Whitfield, lived 4.1 kilometers away. The gravel access road that connected her property to the main highway saw almost no traffic. Sandra had chosen that isolation deliberately. After years of working in a busy Edmonton hospital, the quiet of the Albertan countryside had felt like relief. The first sign that something was wrong came 2 weeks before the night of December 9th. Sandra began finding the gate to her property unlocked in the mornings. She was certain she was locking it each evening. It was part of her routine, as automatic as turning off the kitchen lights. She changed the padlock. The gate continued to be found open. She reported it to the local RCMP detachment. An officer drove out, walked the property, found nothing, and filed a minor incident report. It was the kind of report that sits in a drawer and is never looked at again, until it is. December 9th, 2001, was a cold Monday. Sandra finished her last remote patient consultation at 7:30 in the evening, ate dinner, and spent the next 90 minutes reviewing continuing education materials. By 9 o'clock, she was preparing for bed. The farmhouse was warm and quiet. There was nothing to indicate that the next hour would end her life. At 9:22 in the evening, Sandra called 911. The recording of that call is preserved in RCMP archives and has been reviewed by investigators, forensic psychologists, and law enforcement trainers over the years since. Her voice at the start of the call is the voice you would expect from a medical professional. Tight but controlled, the vocal quality of someone managing a spike of adrenaline through trained discipline. She reports hearing scratching sounds on the exterior basement door, the door that opened from outside directly into the lower level of the house. She says the scratching has been occurring for approximately 8 minutes. She says it is getting more insistent. The dispatcher routes 2 patrol units immediately. Estimated response time, 18 minutes. Sandra is told to stay on the line. She confirms all interior doors are locked. She is upstairs in the bedroom at the end of the hall. She does not want to look out the windows. She is waiting. Then the scratching stops. 5 seconds of silence that the dispatcher later described as the most unsettling moment of the call. And then, Sandra's voice drops slightly, and she says, "Something is inside the basement now." The dispatcher asks how she knows. Sandra says she can hear footsteps on the basement stairs. Slow, measured, not running, moving as if whatever was climbing was in absolutely no hurry. The dispatcher tells her to go out the bedroom window onto the porch overhang and get to her truck. Sandra says she cannot. She explains the layout. To reach the front door, she would have to pass the top of the basement stairs, and the basement door opens directly into that hallway. She is trapped by the architecture of her own house. She says she is upstairs with her bedroom door locked. The dispatcher asks if there is another exit. Sandra says there is a window that leads to the porch roof. She can climb down from there. The footsteps stop. Sandra says everything is quiet. The dispatcher tells her, "This is the moment. Move now. Get out while it is silent." Sandra agrees. The recording captures her getting up, moving toward the window, the creak of old floorboards, the rustle of clothing. Then she makes a sound, a sharp, involuntary intake of breath, and she stops. When she speaks again, her voice has changed. It is still controlled, barely, but something has entered it that was not there before. Something that 11 years of medical emergencies and rural crises had not put there. She says that someone is standing at the bottom of the stairs, looking up at her bedroom door. The dispatcher asks how she can know that if she is inside with the door locked. Sandra says she can see through the gap at the bottom of the door. She can see boots, men's work boots, standing perfectly, completely still. The dispatcher tells her to go through the window right now. Sandra says she is going. The recording captures her moving. And then there is a sound that investigators have described in their reports as one of the most violent acoustic events they have ever heard on a 911 recording. A crack of timber, the sound of a door frame being shattered with tremendous force. Sandra screams. The line fills with the sounds of chaos. Something hitting the floor, movement, and then silence. The call drops at 9 minutes and 41 seconds. Officers arrived at the farmhouse at 9:47. The front door was unlocked. The interior of the ground floor was completely undisturbed. No overturned furniture, no signs of a struggle. The basement door in the hallway was closed and latched. Upstairs, Sandra's bedroom door was off its hinges, lying on the floor inside the room. The door frame was shattered outward in a pattern consistent with multiple heavy blows, not a single kick, but repeated, forceful impacts. The structural damage was significant. Investigators determined the force required was extraordinary, well beyond what a single person acting quickly could be expected to produce. Sandra was at the bottom of the basement stairs, lying on her back with her arms straight at her sides, as if she had been placed there with care. Her eyes were open. There was no blood, no bruising, no visible injury of any kind. She was dead. The autopsy found no cause, no cardiac abnormality, no stroke, no poisoning, no trauma consistent with a fall or an assault. The coroner's report concluded that Sandra's heart had simply stopped. In a 35-year-old woman who had passed a full physical examination 6 weeks earlier and had no cardiac history, no family history of heart disease, and no conditions that should have made her vulnerable. The cause of death was listed as undetermined. It remained so. The investigation of the scene produced something even more disturbing than the absence of cause of death. The exterior basement door showed fresh gouge marks on its outer surface, deep, parallel gouges consistent with fingernails or a narrow blade. Paint chips from the gouges were still on the ground beneath the door, but the door was deadbolted from the inside. The deadbolt in question was a single-cylinder lock that could only be engaged by turning a thumb turn from inside the basement. There was no mechanism for engaging it from outside. No one was inside that basement when officers arrived. Then the phone company delivered a finding that investigators described as the single most inexplicable piece of evidence in the case. The exterior phone junction box on the side of the farmhouse had been cut. The line had been severed cleanly with a bladed tool, likely wire cutters. Standard procedure confirmed that a severed line cannot transmit calls. But the phone company's technical analysis of the cut wire, examining oxidation patterns, weather exposure of the freshly cut copper, and environmental factors, placed the time of the cut between 8:45 and 9:10 in the evening. Sandra's 911 call was logged at 9:22. 12 minutes after the line, by every physical measure, could no longer carry a signal. The call existed, the recording existed, the dispatcher's contemporaneous log existed. The officers had responded to it and arrived to find Sandra dead. But the line that carried the call had been severed before the call was made. The phone company reviewed their analysis 3 times. They had no explanation. They still do not. A forensic sweep of the property found fresh tire tracks in the soft ground near the back fence line, a section invisible from any window of the house. The tracks led to the property from a fire road running through adjacent crownland. The fire road's gate padlock had been cut. The tire tread pattern was cast and analyzed. It was never matched to any registered vehicle in the provincial database. The Whitfield family, Sandra's nearest neighbors, sold their property 4 months later and relocated to British Columbia. A mutual acquaintance reported that Mrs. Whitfield had told her they had been experiencing disturbing events in the weeks following Sandra's death. Their dog refused to go outside after dark. Her husband had twice seen a figure standing motionless at the edge of their north field at dusk. Both times, by the time he put on his coat and went outside to investigate, the field was empty. Sandra's death remains classified as a suspicious death with undetermined circumstances. No suspect has ever been identified. No motive has ever been established. The tire tracks are the only physical evidence placing another person at the property that night, and they lead nowhere. The 911 call, that should not have been possible, sits in an RCMP archive in Edmonton, and the question that investigators keep returning to, the question that has no answer, is not how Sandra died, but how she made a phone call on a line that was already dead. Patrick had been a licensed building contractor for 17 years when he took the job that would change the rest of his life. He was 41 years old, based out of Dryden, Ontario, and had built a solid regional reputation on a specific willingness. He took on jobs that other contractors turned down, the difficult ones, the structural assessments on buildings that had been sitting empty for decades, the demolition work that required patience and care. He was not reckless, but he was methodical and thorough, and he had seen enough odd things inside old buildings to know that forgotten spaces always tell stories if you look at them carefully enough. The job that found him in the spring of 2006 came from a small community heritage group that had purchased an old United Church building approximately 18 kilometers outside Dryden on a logging road. The church had been built in 1938 to serve a logging community that never quite grew into the town its founders had imagined. For nearly 50 years, it had been the center of a scattered rural congregation. Then, in 1987, the last dozen elderly parishioners finally acknowledged what everyone already knew. The community had contracted too much to sustain a functioning church. The building was decommissioned, the doors were padlocked, and for 19 years it sat in slow, uncomplaining deterioration while the forest worked its way back toward the walls. By 2006, the white paint had peeled away in long, pale strips. The roof had developed multiple leaks that had rotted through sections of the ceiling. The windows were broken. Blackberry canes grew up against the foundation. The heritage group that purchased it had plans to stabilize and repurpose the structure as a community meeting hall. They hired Patrick to conduct the structural assessment and begin the demolition of unsalvageable interior elements. A part-time laborer named Greg assisted 2 days a week. The budget was tight. Patrick mostly worked alone. Before he began, Patrick spoke briefly with an elderly woman named Dorothy, who had grown up attending the church and still lived in Dryden. He was doing due diligence, talking to people who knew the building before he touched it. Dorothy was cooperative, but became visibly uncomfortable when the subject of the church's minister came up. She said she had stopped attending in the early 1970s. She said the minister at the time, a man who had been there since the late 1940s, made her uneasy. She was a teenager then, and could not fully articulate what bothered her, except to say that he was extremely interested in children from struggling families and had a habit of keeping certain kids behind after Sunday service. Extra guidance sessions, he called them. Dorothy said she had tried for a long time to forget about it. Patrick thanked her for her time and went to work. He thought about Dorothy's words more than once in the days that followed. On his third day of work, inside the church, Patrick began removing deteriorated wall paneling in the sanctuary behind the altar. This was standard procedure. Assess the wall condition, document damage, clear materials before structural evaluation. He worked methodically, prying away sections of paneling and stacking them for disposal. Then he encountered a section of wall, approximately 1.8 meters wide and running floor to ceiling, that sounded hollow when he knocked on it. The adjacent sections were solid, this one was not. Patrick examined the paneling more closely. It was noticeably newer than the surrounding material, perhaps installed in the late 1960s or 1970s based on the style and fasteners. Someone had put this paneling up after the original wall, and they had done it over something. He used his pry bar to open a section. Behind it was not the original wall. It was a false framework of 2x4 lumber, deliberately constructed to seal off a space that already existed behind it. Patrick widened the opening until he could step through. Inside was a small concrete room, roughly 3 meters square. The air was cold and stale, with the particular quality of a space that has been sealed for a very long time. His flashlight swept the space, and he stopped moving. On the floor, arranged in 3 perfect concentric circles, were children's shoes, dozens of them, small sizes, ranging from toddler to a child of approximately 11 or 12 years old. Some were leather, some were canvas. All were old, consistent in style, with the 1950s through to the early 1970s. Every shoe had its toe pointing toward the center of the innermost circle. The arrangement was not accidental. It was not the result of things shifting over time. Each shoe had been placed with deliberate, careful precision. Patrick stood in that room for a long time before he moved again. He crouched down and examined the shoes without touching them. Inside several, he could make out names written in faded ink. Tommy, Ruth, Dennis, Carol, James. Children's names, written by an adult hand, in shoes that had belonged to children who were no longer wearing them. In the far corner of the room, he saw something he had missed on first inspection, a section of the concrete floor that had been patched. New concrete poured over an irregular shape. He approached it and pressed his fingers against the edge. It lifted. It had not been sealed. It had simply been placed. Beneath it was dirt, and partially buried in the dirt were items of clothing: a small green rain jacket, a pair of corduroy trousers sized for a child of perhaps 7 or 8 years old, a white dress, with blue embroidery at the collar, the fabric still recognizable despite the dampness and time. Among the clothing, Patrick found one thing that sent his investigation in an entirely new direction. A composition notebook, water-damaged but partially legible. Its cover was swollen with moisture, but the interior pages had survived. The entries were written in a neat, deliberate hand. They were not a diary. They were records, dates spanning from 1954 to 1969. First names, brief notations, words like collected, secured, and at rest appearing beside each name. 14 names in total. Patrick photographed every page with his phone and walked out of that church as quickly as he could move. He drove to a gas station 3 kilometers away and called the OPP from the payphone outside. Officers arrived within the hour. By that evening, a forensic unit had been dispatched from Thunder Bay. The church was secured as a potential crime scene. Patrick was interviewed at length. He described precisely what he had touched, only the paneling with his pry bar and the edge of the concrete patch with 2 fingers. He had not disturbed the shoes. He had not disturbed the clothing. Everything else was exactly as he had found it. The notebook became the pivotal piece of evidence. Document analysts confirmed it had been written by a single author across an extended period. 14 names, cross-referenced against cold missing persons files from the region. Children who had vanished from logging communities and small towns in northwestern Ontario between 1950 and 1970. 9 names matched. 9 children who had disappeared without witnesses, without leads, whose cases had been filed away in the confident assumption that they were runaways or accidents or tragedies without perpetrators. Their files had not been opened in decades. Now someone was opening them. Ground-penetrating radar scanned the entire church property. Multiple anomalies. Excavation at 5 separate locations around the building produced more buried clothing, more personal items. A hairbrush with initials scratched into the handle. A small metal toy truck. A child's leather-bound Bible with a name stamped on the inside front cover. No skeletal remains were found anywhere on the property. The children themselves were not there, only the evidence of them. Church records identified the minister, who had served from 1949 until his abrupt, unexplained resignation in 1972. Reverend Gerald Moss. He had left without notice, without providing a forwarding address, without any contact with the diocese after his departure. Investigators traced him through public records to Saskatchewan, then to 2 small communities, and then to a death certificate. Gerald Moss had died in 1989 in a rural Manitoba care facility, having spent his final years under the name Gerald Moore, listing his occupation as retired laborer. Staff at the care facility, contacted by investigators, remembered him as a quiet man who kept to himself and became agitated when children visited the facility during family events. Without bodies, without surviving witnesses, with the primary suspect dead for 17 years, prosecutors determined the evidence could not meet the criminal threshold for posthumous findings. The families of the 9 matched missing children were contacted. Most of the parents had died. Brothers, sisters, nieces, and nephews received the news. Several described it as the most devastating and necessary moment of their lives, to finally know, after decades of not knowing, that something had happened, that their children had not simply wandered away. The church was demolished. The site was cleared. A small memorial marker was placed on the property. It lists no names. It reads only, "For those who were not forgotten." Patrick relocated to Sudbury 2 years later and declined every interview request that followed. Friends who knew him before and after say he is not the same man. The church renovation project was the last job of its kind he ever took. Claire was not the kind of researcher who used words like extraordinary or unprecedented lightly. She had grown up in a fishing family in Cape Breton, Nova Scotia, and had spent her childhood learning to read the ocean the way other children learn to read books, as a system of information, not as a place of mystery. She had earned her doctorate in marine acoustics and had spent 4 years in the field documenting underwater sound environments across the North Atlantic. She understood the ocean as a scientist understands any complex system. There were known variables and unknown variables, and the job was to systematically reduce the second category. She did not romanticize the sea. She measured it. She was 31 years old in August 2013, attached to a federally funded study on bowhead whale communication in the waters southeast of Baffin Island, Nunavut. The study was based out of a small seasonal monitoring station, and Claire had been in the field for 3 weeks when the incident occurred. 2 other researchers, a cytologist named Marcus Webb and a data analyst named Jennifer Holt, were stationed with her. The communications officer on duty was a graduate researcher named Ben Hartley, whose job was to maintain radio contact with all personnel in the field and log all transmissions. 3 days before Claire disappeared, her hydrophone array began picking up something that did not belong in her data. An intermittent low-frequency signal, appearing at irregular intervals across multiple recording sessions that matched no catalogued species in the marine mammal vocalization database. This was not, on its own, extraordinary. The ocean produces numerous sounds, and the Arctic in particular contains acoustic phenomena that researchers are still working to fully classify. But Claire's notes document something that elevated the signal from a curiosity to a concern. It was moving. Across 3 days of recordings, the source of the signal shifted position, but it consistently returned to approximately the same 4-kilometer radius of open water east of the station. It was not drifting, it was oriented. Claire flagged it in a satellite email to her supervising institute. The reply told her to document it, and they would analyze it when she returned to Halifax. That email exchange was later retrieved by investigators and entered into evidence. It is one of the most cited documents in the case. On August 19, 2013, Claire departed the monitoring station at 6:30 in the morning, aboard a 24-foot research vessel equipped with hydrophones, an underwater camera array, GPS, satellite communication, and a registered emergency beacon. The weather was clear. The sea state was calm. Ben Hartley logged her departure and confirmed the check-in protocol. Radio contact every 90 minutes without exception. Claire acknowledged and motored out. Her 8 o'clock check-in was normal. She reported elevated hydrophone activity in her target zone and said she was positioning to deploy the camera array. Her voice was the voice of a researcher who had found what she came to find. Professional, focused, pleased. At 9:15, she radioed again. Ben Hartley later described what he heard in her voice as a change in register. Not panic, not yet, but the vocal quality of someone working very hard to sound professional, while something unexpected was happening around them. She reported large subsurface disturbances around her vessel. Multiple sources, moving in coordinated patterns. She said the movements were far too fast and far too organized to be consistent with bowhead whales. She said whatever was creating the disturbances was circling her boat in arcs. Ben asked if she wanted to return to the station. Claire said no. She said this was precisely the kind of anomalous behavior the study was designed to document. She said she was deploying the camera array At 9:44, Claire radioed again. The professionalism was still there, but it was thinner now, stretched over something underneath it. She reported that the subsurface disturbances had converged directly beneath her vessel. Her hydrophones were recording sounds she had not heard before, low-frequency biological tones with a mechanical regularity, repeating at intervals she described as too precise to be organic. The sounds were getting louder. Ben told her to pull the array and return immediately. Claire said she was already starting the engine. At 9:51, Claire made her final transmission. Ben described what he heard in the first seconds of that call as the sound of someone who has run out of composure. Not hysteria, but a stripped-down urgency that he had never heard from her before, and that told him something was genuinely wrong before she said a word. She said something is wrong. She said the shapes are surfacing. Ben asked her to describe what she was seeing. Claire did not answer the question. Instead, in a voice Ben described as hollow and entirely unlike her normal way of speaking, she said, "They are not whales. They are not whales." Ben asked her what they were. Claire began to answer. Her words were cut off by a sound that Ben described as a sustained, high-pitched scream. Not human, coming through the radio at a volume that made him pull the headset away from his ears. The transmission ended. The line went silent. The station attempted contact continuously for 40 minutes. No response. The emergency protocol was activated. The Canadian Coast Guard was notified at 10:38. A search and rescue vessel departed within 20 minutes. Claire's boat was found at 1:15 in the afternoon, drifting approximately 3 kilometers from her last GPS position. The engine was running, fuel sufficient for several more hours of operation. All research equipment was intact and functioning, still recording. Her personal dry bag was on the seat. Her emergency beacon had not been activated. Her safety vest was stowed, unclipped and properly put away, not abandoned in a hurry. And critically, the kill switch lanyard, the safety device that attaches to the operator and shuts the engine automatically if the operator falls overboard while wearing it, was disconnected and coiled neatly on the console. It had been deliberately removed. Whatever happened to Claire, she had taken off her kill switch lanyard before it happened. She had, for some reason investigators cannot explain, made herself vulnerable to exactly the outcome that safety equipment existed to prevent. Claire was not on the boat. No blood, no signs of a physical struggle, nothing overturned. Her research log was open on the seat to that morning's entry. The final handwritten note read, "Array deployed 0841, signal strength increasing, source count, minimum 4, possibly more, closing fast." The underwater camera array was recovered from the water. The footage from its final 11 minutes shows the camera drifting in open water, the surface light filtering down. In the final 4 minutes of footage, 3 large dark shapes pass within 20 meters of the lens, moving in a coordinated arc. The footage has been reviewed by marine biologists from 3 separate institutions. None can identify the shapes. They are too large and move too quickly for any documented species in those waters. One reviewer noted in her written assessment that the shapes appeared to be moving in a deliberate formation, not the scattered opportunistic movement typical of marine wildlife, but something with an apparent shared direction of travel. The hydrophone recordings from Claire's final transmission period were analyzed by acoustics researchers at 2 universities. The sounds do not match any entry in the marine mammal vocalization database. The frequency range is biological in origin, but the repetition pattern, the intervals Claire described as too precise to be organic, follows a mathematical regularity that has no equivalent in any documented natural acoustic system. One acoustics professor, in a paper published 2 years after the incident, described the signal as unlike anything in 30 years of fieldwork, before declining to speculate further on its origin. 6 weeks after Claire's disappearance, a supply vessel transiting through the same waters reported its sonar detecting a cluster of large moving objects at depth. The crew estimated 4 to 6 targets, each consistent in size, with a large marine animal moving in a tight circular formation. When the captain altered course to investigate, all targets dispersed simultaneously and disappeared from sonar within 90 seconds. The captain filed an official report with Transport Canada. The report is part of the Claire case file. Investigators noted, no conclusions have been drawn. The case is officially listed as an unexplained disappearance at sea. No body has ever been recovered. No physical cause for Claire's disappearance has ever been established. The recording of her final transmission, specifically the moment she says they are not whales in that hollow, stripped voice, twice, as if saying it a second time might somehow make it less true, is considered by investigators who have worked maritime missing persons cases across Atlantic Canada to be among the most disturbing pieces of audio evidence they have ever encountered. They say it is the certainty in her voice that makes it so difficult to set aside. Claire was not panicking. She was reporting. And what she was reporting, she had already conclusively ruled out the obvious explanation for. She knew what whales sound like. She had spent 4 years recording them. Whatever was in the water around her that morning, she was certain of what it was not.